Hey guys, it's your boy, True Dill Tom. So today we're going to be looking at Gilles Deleuze, and by extension of this, Felix Guattari, and how they're going to provide a very useful and interesting diagnosis of where we are at with current culture, especially in the later half of the 20th century. And this is going to be a multi-part series, and how each video will be formatted is we'll explain what Deleuze set out to do, the actual content of some of his most important ideas, and then their interplay with pop culture. But this video will be more focused on theory than culture, but as we move on, the connection between the two will become evident. So personally, the first text I had read by Deleuze was Difference and Repetition, and it is a text concerned with forms, properties, and the subject of morphogenesis. How do forms come to be, and how do they relate to each other and organize in such a way as to produce things? So a big part of the postmodern philosophers' ideas is in recognizing the existing philosophical tradition before them as being full of these arbitrary relationships between words and concepts, or signs and signifiers as we've come to call them. So being or presence is privileged over absence. In the case of Derrida, he points out how in the logocentric tradition, speech is privileged over writing because it is the closest to the source of being, the speaker is privileged over the speechwriter, and so on. And here Deleuze will see difference as being deprivileged and made secondary to that of sameness. And this priority for sameness Deleuze seeks to deconstruct, and instead he will construct his own ontology of difference. In this way, you can kind of think of Deleuze as the closest to a traditional metaphysician out of all of the postmodernist philosophers. We spoke about in my stream on postmodernism that Heidegger's task was to reverse Plato's separation of being and becoming with Plato's construction of the realm of forms that all reality is a mere shadow of, and instead re-implement being into becoming. And Deleuze is similar, but has an emphasis on science and mathematics. So to illustrate the idea of Plato's that is adopted and reiterated all the way to Hegel is one that sees the world as copies and models of these transcendental forms, and it privileges sameness over difference, and there is no ontology of forms coming into being through their differences. Things coming into being because they are the same as these forms. And so, like Heidegger focusing on the ontology of being, Deleuze wants to construct an ontology of difference. So in categorizing this stretch between Plato and Hegel, Deleuze will introduce what are three different syntheses of time. Some have argued that the concepts of the id, ego, and superego from Freud each correspond to a synthesis of time, and that these agencies are primarily based upon neurological processes, because after all, Deleuze was coming out of the Freudian tradition. But of the three syntheses of time, the first is the passive syntheses of habit, which is vis-a-vis David Hume. If you have read Hume, one of his biggest contributions is this devastating deconstruction of causality that sees causes between events as just a continuous conjunction, and so undermining this causal linkage we draw in the mind. In other words, causality, like inference or induction, is just habit. You operate on the assumption that in the future your car will start when you turn the keys in the ignition, just because it's happened in the past. It's habit. And so all of the proof systems built on top of induction and causation, such as science, are fundamentally based on the irrational assumption that in the future things will be like they were in the past. The sun will rise tomorrow because it has risen in the past. And this would awaken Kant from his dogmatic slumber, as he said, and would open up questions of which Kant's work is responding to, that causality is the organizing principle in how we make sense of the world that is built into the structure of the mind. The transcendental unity of perception, the unity of the I think, this is what Deleuze was challenging. But understanding Hume and Kant aside, what is important to know is Deleuze thought the synthesis of time took place prior to thinking in the unconscious, in contradiction to Kant. And so we have this idea of habit. The past is incarnated into the present to inform our actions. And this presence of the past occurs through this process that Deleuze calls contraction. So if we look at, say, animal forms, as again the emergence of forms is what Deleuze is interested in, we can see animals as being the contractions of water, air, and trees. An organism in an environment is always more aware of itself than the environment it is within. But if you go far back enough in time, the organism is comprised of the material of the environment. The organism is a mode of the environment and inseparable from it, similar to Derrida's idea that there is nothing outside the context. You can see the motifs emerge that unite these thinkers as being postmodern. So we are constantly bringing the past into the present, creating multiple selves in the process. All the contractions splinter the psyche into miniature egos, like a schizophrenic or the larvae of a fly. These are our larval selves, and we will return to the idea of schismatizing the ego once again, but for now, the idea is that we are in the present. We look to physical things in the past, and then we incarnate them as conceptual things in the future. This is all on the assumption that the present moment is constantly repeating, but of course with these differences, otherwise we would be living in Groundhog's Day. But if there is difference, then there was never a repeating instance to create the conceptual future to begin with. So the living present is atemporal and gives rise to time, so we arrive at the manifold of synthesized and contracted presents, with their variable rhythms, and the significance of it is that although we tend to think that the present is and the past is not or is no longer, the opposite is in fact the case. The second synthesis of time is the active synthesis of memory. This is the active way by which the past is brought back into the present. If we return to the idea of the splintering of the ego, the I also fractures into a self. There is this plane of the I and the self, where there are two poles of the past present and the occurring present, and the memory oscillates between these polar opposites. This is memory, the return of the past into the present, while the third synthesis is concerned with the production of the new or the future. So this is easily the most complex out of the three syntheses, and it is worth now remembering that time for Deleuze does not move from one actual term to another, but from the virtual to the actual. If we look at some of the ideas before Deleuze, you can see Kierkegaard in his book Repetition attempt to make a theory of repetition that moved away from seeing the future as the mere recurrence of things in the past. Hume had seen repeating series as producing habit, as we just discussed. That is, when something happens, we then habitually expect other things to happen because they had happened in conjunction in the past, quite circularly. And you can then shift this onto history as to see the French Revolution, a singularity that, despite being unique, was simultaneously modelled after the Roman Revolution, as if the French were resuscitated Romans. The past and present are transformed into the future. The new is brought forward from the past and the present. So, to Deleuze, repetition is morphogenesis, and this is similar to Nietzsche's idea of the eternal return, which to Deleuze isn't to be seen as the endless repetition of the same, but as repetition to produce difference, to create new from the old. So the eternal return brings back intensive structures and reincarnates them in new, novel ways. So the third synthesis is empty time. How is it that the circle of habit and memory is broken to create the novel or the new? And Deleuze talks of a rupturing event, a deterritorialization by where the new destabilizes the I and ruptures the self. The I-self axis that memory operates on is broken from the emergence of the future, and so the self rebuilds itself in the future in a new manner. The eternal return collapses the I-self axis and arrives at a man with no qualities who must rebuild. This is the process of morphogenesis, or the production of new forms that he is talking about. The new announces itself conceptually via a type of ruptural event. So the event occurs and space is made for the new, and then our thoughts play catch up with it. And this emphasis on the new segues us into the next part of difference and repetition, that being his critique of what is called the image of thought. The conventional, systematic view of thought is one that is based on recognition. The view of thought as the agreement of knowledge with its object. Truth is the correspondence of the intellect and things. This is called correspondence theory of truth. And the image of thought convention sees a binary of truth and falsehood, the later being defined as error, and so that which is false is that which is not true, and so it is said that which is in the intellect and has no agreement with objects can't be said to be knowledge. So knowledge is the sameness of intellect and things. So moreover, it is also said everyone has the ability to recognize the true when they see it, and Deleuze goes on to say that this view, the theory of recognition, doesn't have any room for the new. In Plato's philosophy, knowledge is the awakening of forms within you. There is this world of forms of which objects are a shadow of, and we have knowledge of such forms imprinted on our souls that are forgotten of, and so knowledge isn't exactly new, but is the remembering of things that were already there. And this would be reiterated with Descartes, who had the notion of innate ideas, and for Deleuze, all of this reduces thought to simply convention. Instead, philosophy to Deleuze is not concerned with conventionality, but is the increasing of one's thinking, and to find new ways of thinking by moving out of conventionality. To Deleuze, recognition theory is dogmatic. After all, if we return to the idea of sameness, recognition theory sees knowledge as the sameness of the intellect and things. But if the new is difference, then to know new things cannot be a matter of recognition. And additionally, Deleuze sees this convention of recognition as problematic because the only negative in it is error, things like mental illness, insanity, stupidity, cowardice, missing the point. All these are negatives that are not included in the theory of recognition, yet they are all ways of thinking. This is a similar attitude within the 1960s and the reliance on psychedelics as a means of seeing things in a different way, of increasing one's thought. In addition to the deconstruction of traditional modernist bourgeois philosophy and culture that existed beforehand. The 60s saw the introduction of new negatives and new positives to try and dish out new things from the culture they had found themselves in. This would also explain the disappearance of identitarianism in the 20th century. Not only as a political force, but in cultural studies, people can be said to reach outside their identity for new things. Identities are territorial and need to prevent thought from expanding outside those territories in order for its principle of movement to homogenize its space of action. In other words, identities border in thinking, almost like creating nation states of thought. The event that ushers in the new is in nature heterogeneous, and so cultural theorists in the space of the new begin to see culture having heterogeneous beginnings also. So in philosophy, social life, and political events, there are these ruptures that produce new agencies of enunciation or tools, new ways of thinking, and the revolutionary thinker lets the new announce itself. This is always met first with the conventional thinkers declaring these ideas dangerous, stupid, or too noisy and overcomplicated. So this can be seen in respect to Heidegger, who writes of there being no complete truth system. It isn't to say that the recognition theory of truth or Plato's separation of being from becoming are erroneous, as much as it is to say that they have concealed things, and so when those things become unconcealed, the lighting by which we see things changes, and those conventions become worn out and are slowly unrooted, and you see attitudes change. You see the emergence of 60s culture and the unfolding of everything around it. After all, the new captures us because we don't have the apparatus to apprehend it, and we are excited by it. But anyway guys, that's going to have to do it for this one. This will be a video in a series, and so we will be going through Deleuze and unpacking his ideas and seeing their relevance, hopefully more to pulp culture as we go on. I already have a lot planned out for this series, but guys, if you like this, remember to follow me on social media. I have Twitter and Instagram, which I'm active on, and I also have a Patreon. If you really liked these videos, you can go and donate there, and that is greatly appreciated. Thanks guys, have a good one.